Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson visited Ankara this week to hold talks with Foreign Minister Merve Tahiroğlu and President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan.
On the fifth day of his Middle East trip, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson paid a two-day working visit to Turkey amid tensions between Ankara and Washington over the situation in northern Syria. On Thursday evening, Tillerson met with President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Foreign Affairs Minister Merve Tahiroğlu behind closed doors for a 3.5-hour dinner. Although no joint press conference was made after the meeting, Hürriyet Daily News reported that, according to a Turkish presidential source, Erdoğan and Tillerson had an open and productive talk, exchanging views on the fight against terrorism. During their meeting at the presidential complex, Erdoğan clearly told Tillerson Turkey's priorities and expectations from the US on bilateral ties and regional developments, the source added. According to Reuters, Turkey proposed the United States that Kurdish YPG fighters withdraw to the east of the Euphrates River in Syria and that Turkish and US troops be stationed together in the country's Manbij area. Secretary Tillerson and Foreign Affairs Minister Çavuşoğlu appeared in a joint press conference after their meeting the following day. We will start with Manbij. We will ensure it. Who administers these provinces and who provides security for them is important to reach stability. We can take steps with the US on this issue after YPG militants are removed from Manbij, Çavuşoğlu said. Çavuşoğlu added that Turkey and the US have decided to establish mechanisms to tackle the many issues currently harming relations between the two countries. Tillerson reaffirmed the US's deep and important relationship with Turkey. Tillerson added that Washington and Ankara share the same objectives in Syria, emphasizing the defeat of ISIS and forming secure zones in Syria. Meanwhile, CNN reported that Secretary Tillerson's meeting with President Erdoğan was highly unusual because Tillerson reportedly wasn't accompanied by an American translator, any aides, or a note-taker. Turkey was the last stop of Tillerson's five-nation trip, followed by his stops in Egypt, Kuwait, Jordan, and Lebanon.
Joining us from Rome, Italy tonight to talk about U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's Ankara visit is Soli Özel, who is a lecturer at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. Good evening, Mr. Özel. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
So all eyes were on Ankara today and yesterday for this very key visit by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Turkey's operation in Afrin, and whether it will extend this military operation over to the other side of the river Euphrates, to the town of Manbij, appeared as a very key component of these high-level meetings. So, Mr. Özel, what's your overall evaluation of this very important visit by Tillerson?
Well, in order to have a proper evaluation, you need to have data, and I think we have a drought of data. But there are a few things that come to my mind. First, Rex Tillerson has not really been a very effective Secretary of State. Whether or not he was in the loop most of the time was being questioned. But after all, he is the Secretary of State of the United States, and he came to Turkey as part of his Middle East tour, which excluded Israel, but included Lebanon, Jordan, and Kuwait. And secondly, Tillerson's visit was not the only encounter that Turkish authorities had with their American counterparts. On Sunday, National Security Advisor to the President, General McMaster, was in Turkey, in Ankara, and spoke with the presidential spokesperson, Ibrahim Kalın. And on Wednesday, the Turkish Defense Minister and the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, saw one another in Brussels, and they have had an interesting conversation based on the rendering of our minister about that one. And then finally, Rex Tillerson came and met with the president for over 3 hours, and then with the foreign minister. My sense is that there must have been a lot more to talk about than just Afrin or Manbij. We know that the Turkish-American relations have been in quite a row recently. There are plenty of issues on which the two sides really do not see eye to eye. And Afrin and the support that the United States gives to YPG forces within Syria is only one of those, and obviously the most important from a security perspective. So far, all we know is that the two sides decided to discuss matters very openly and frankly, and I'm sure they've done that. They've had plenty of time. And we also heard that Turkey proposed to the United States to actually secure Manbij together, which I suppose means get PYG out. And as you promised, by the way, before Turkey engaged in the Euphrates Shield operation even, the Kurdish forces were supposed to stay to the east bank of the Euphrates River. They are still in Manbij. So I suppose Turkey proposes get the Kurds out of there, and if you really need forces to secure the city and you don't really want to deploy too many of your own troops, then we can come and do it. What the Americans have responded to this, or will they respond to this, that remains to be seen. But that is an interesting opening on the part of Turkey, in my view.
Mm-hmm. And what does this visit tell us, if anything, about the future of U.S.-Turkey relations, in your opinion?
Well, the high-level encounters suggest that both sides take the crisis very seriously. I also suspect there is a willingness to actually somehow patch relations, and they are seeking formulas to figure out a way of really mending relations, rebuilding the bridges, and move on. My sense is the United States is very interested in having Turkey by its side, since its main goal appears to be now under the Trump administration, containment of Iran, and containment of Iran would necessitate more than just the Kurdish forces inside Syria. Turkey's help would be needed. Secondly, I'm sure the American security establishment is not happy about the apparent drift of Turkey away from NATO and towards Russia, and even the operation in Afrin is kind of being coordinated with Russia, because it's the Russians that either open or close the airspace over Syria. On all those scores, the Americans have a lot to worry about, and the Turks are concerned about many other things. So such high-level meetings, in my judgment, would clear the way somewhat, and I hope that they can, when they get to the nitty-gritty of things, they will also find the necessary paths to cross in order to mend those relations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Özel,
most welcome.
for joining us tonight.
Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll continue with a brief overview of Turkey-US relations in the recent period.
Turkey-US cooperation dates back decades, although it has experienced an unusual twist in the recent period, particularly throughout the Syrian civil war. Ties between the two countries have become increasingly strained in the past few years, with the Syrian Kurds, the extradition of Islamic cleric Fethullah Gülen, and the trial of former Halkbank executive Hakan Atilla being the main problem areas. The traditional partnership between Turkey and the US has its roots in the Cold War era. Alongside Greece, Turkey joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in February 1952, marking the first addition to the original alliance formed in 1949. In recent years, however, US-Turkish relations have taken a steep hit, primarily due to disagreements over the United States' support for Syrian Kurds fighting against the Islamic State in Syria and its harboring of exiled Turkish cleric Fethullah Gülen. Turkey's detachment from the US is assumed to be leading Ankara to build stronger ties with other countries such as Russia and Iran, who oppose critical US interests in the region. Relations between the United States and Turkey have shown signs of deterioration during the Syrian civil war, and especially over the Kurdish question. US forces in Syria's war are openly allied with the Kurdish People's Protection Unit's YPG fighters and support them militarily. Turkey, on the other hand, considers the YPG militants as terrorists. Last month, US Army Colonel Ryan Dillon, the spokesman for the US-led coalition to counter ISIS, announced that the coalition was working jointly with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces to establish and train the new Syrian Border Security Force. The plan, which would involve Kurdish militias operating in the area, angered Ankara to the point that President Erdogan declared that he would strangle the force before it's even born. Turkey views the Syrian Kurdish forces, known as the PYD and YPG, as an extension of the Turkish-based separatist Kurdistan Workers' Party (PKK), which Ankara and Washington both consider a terrorist organization. On January 20th, Turkey launched a military operation against the YPG militia in the district of Afrin in northwestern Syria. The US has called for Turkey to show restraint in its Afrin operation. Ankara, however, has warned the US to remove its troops from the YPG-held Manbij town as it threatens to extend the operation towards the town east of Afrin. The US has more than 2,000 special forces and support troops inside Syria, mainly east of the Euphrates in an area also controlled by the YPG, but separate from Afrin, which is west of the river. A failed coup attempt against Erdogan on July 15, 2016 was another event that severely strained relations between Ankara and Washington. Erdogan has accused the Gülen movement, led by Fethullah Gülen, a Turkish cleric who lives in exile in Pennsylvania, as the main culprit in the attempted coup, and demanded that the US extradite Gülen to Turkey. The US has thus far refused, demanding solid evidence from Turkey, and Gülen's status remains a sticking point between the two governments. In October last year, the US suspended visas and consular services at its mission in Turkey after two Turkish nationals who were members of the US consular staff were arrested over alleged links to the Gülen movement. However, in December, the US and Turkey resumed full visa services after Turkey apparently provided Washington with assurances about the detained embassy personnel. Turkey's ties with the US were further strained after Ankara described a New York court's decision to convict a Turkish banker over a massive scheme to help Iran evade American sanctions as a political attack. Mehmet Hakan Atilla, Deputy General Manager of state-run Halkbank, was found guilty of 5 counts of bank fraud and conspiracy to violate US sanctions law. Atilla was found to have conspired with Turkish-Iranian gold trader Reza Zarrab and others to help Iran escape sanctions by disguising financial transactions as humanitarian food payments. Zarrab described a multi-billion-dollar scheme that he said was personally authorized by President Erdogan while he was prime minister and involved bribes to other senior Turkish government officials. The Turkish government, on the other hand, has rejected the verdict, describing it as a political attack.
Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Merve Tahiroğlu, who is a research associate at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good evening, Ms. Tahiroğlu. Welcome once again to This Week in Turkey.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, how is U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's Ankara visit perceived in Washington, D.C.? In other words, how does Washington see this key trip?
Well, of course, it just ended, and we're only getting reports about the meeting now. There isn't much detail that has been shared about what sort of an agreement that the two sides may have reached, but I can tell you the general mood in Washington, especially as the preparing to travel to Turkey, there were some issues that were discussed here, Congress and outside in the American Turkish circles about the brewing problems that have been going on between the two NATO allies. So, of course, the most important of these was Turkey's military operation in northern Syria and Afrin these days. I think Turkey and the United States have see this operation very differently, and in part this reflects how they see the war in Syria and how the future strategies that the two sides envision for the future of Syria in the post-ISIS world. So Turkey's operation in Afrin is, of course, very important for Turkey, but from the United States perspective, it's very concerning because while there's no U.S. presence there, it's essentially operation against the YPG, which is an American partner force elsewhere in northern Syria, as we know it. And I think part of why this matters so much is because over the last few weeks, in the lead up to Tillerson Turkey, we were hearing statements from Ankara, from Turkish officials, threatening that Turkey might take its operation in Afrin towards Manbij afterwards, and that Turkish and American soldiers might actually clash. These may not feel like threats coming from Ankara to the U.S. inside Turkey, but from Washington's perspective, they certainly sound like threats, and certainly sound like this is Ankara's way of trying to get the U.S. to acquiesce to Turkey's demands if it wants to remain in Syria. But of course, this is a predicament for Washington in that its own partner in Syria on the ground is the SDF, which is, of course, predominantly made up of Kurdish fighters and YPG fighters as well. So, the idea that two NATO allies appear to be threatening each other and potentially clashing inside Syria, I mean, of course, many analysts think that would never actually happen. But the fact that we even discuss such a possibility was pretty alarming from Washington's perspective, especially when we put it in the context of U.S.-Turkish relations over the last few years, which of course have had myriad problems and is a very troubled relationship already. So Tillerson's visit was very much seen as was very much, I think, anticipated by the crowd here in Washington to see if any kind of agreement might come between Americans and the Turks from this meeting, but it doesn't really seem like it. The most positive outcome from this meeting is the fact that the two sides didn't mention some of the most contentious issues between the two, and said that they would work on certain mechanisms in order not to clash in Syria. But while, of course, the two armies might not actually clash, they still have clashing interests, very much real and very much causing problems for the bilateral relationship between the two sides.
So you mentioned these mechanisms in your response, and that actually constitutes my next question. This word was used by Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu after his meeting with Tillerson earlier today. What he said was that the two had agreed to set up mechanisms in order to settle the disputes, the series of disputes actually, between the two governments. What do you think is meant by mechanisms here, or what kind of an understanding was reached, do you think, in Ankara today?
So it's hard to exactly what kind of a mechanism they're considering, because they didn't share, neither side shared details about this. But I think what they mean is to come to an agreement between the two sides in order for the two sides not to clash in Manbij. Now, the Turkish side appears to have offered to the United States that if the YPG leaves Manbij, then Turkey might actually deploy joint forces with the United States to keep Manbij. I mean, the important part, the reason why Manbij is so important is because it's in a very strategic spot, and while the war against ISIS is winding down, certainly it's not yet actually over, and it's important for the Americans to remain in Manbij in order to make sure that ISIS doesn't use supply routes going through it to strengthen itself again in Syria. So this should be seen, I think, in the context of the ongoing anti-ISIS fight that the United States is steering. And Turkey has been, of course, for a very long time now, been complaining about the presence of the YPG there, and about whether it should be on the west or the east side of the Euphrates, in order to keep the YPG-controlled plant in northern Syria, just alongside, just across from Turkey's border, separate. But I'm not sure if this strategy that is actually, if it's even a strategy, it's a strategy that could work, because the reality is that the Americans are already in Manbij, and they don't need to leave it. And Turkey is offering, it's unclear whether the YPG would actually even leave Manbij to let Turkish army come there. And of course, there's the question of how long, if the Turkish army did go into Manbij, how long would it stay there? What would it be its purpose? Is it going to remain there for only a few months, or only short term, or would it have to stay there with a much longer presence? And that comes back to question of broader American policy in Syria for the post-ISIS world as well, when we're looking at what is the United States looking to achieve in Syria after the fight against ISIS is somewhat is now. Secretary Tillerson said earlier this year, laid out a bit of a plan for U.S. policy in Syria more broadly in the post-ISIS world. And he said that the Americans are very concerned about Iranian presence there, which of course means the Syrian regime presence, Assad presence, and influence in Syria. So if the U.S. is looking to check that, right now, as I mentioned earlier, its only partner in Syria, local partner in Syria, is the SDF. So this is a predicament for the United States, where it has found itself caught in between the YPG and Turkey, and the two sides are going to be forcing their hands on the Americans to try to push the Americans to work with them. But we have to understand, we have to look at this, I think, in terms of what is the vision that Turkey has for Syria, and what is the vision that the United States has for Syria. Turkey is very much focused and fixated even on the Syrian Kurds and the autonomous rule they have on its own border. Whereas for the United States, the number one priority is to make sure that ISIS is defeated. The second priority is to make sure that the regime influence and, of course, the Iranian and Russian influence is checked, contained inside Syria. These are essentially clashing interests, and that's why I don't see, even if the two sides can come to an agreement so as not to actually clash with each other militarily in Manbij, which of course as two NATO allies shouldn't even have come to this point to begin with. But even if they're able to resolve that issue, this is just a quick fix that doesn't actually address the much bigger divergences that the sides have with regards to Syria.
So we talked about mechanisms, but another one of the rather vague terms that came out of today's press conference with Tillerson and Çavuşoğlu was working groups, which would be formed to solve key issues that have strained relations between the two governments recently. And few other details were shared. There's a lot of data missing, as our previous speaker, Soli Özel, put it. So, what should we make of these working groups? In your opinion, would delegating key issues to these working groups, as they've been put, yield productive results?
Well, I'm not sure if that would actually be effective, or even we have no idea about the details of these plans, so it's very hard to comment on them. But I think we can talk about some of the reasons why that there is even a need for such working groups. For again, I'm going to stress our allies. As the two sides stress the strategic relationship that they have, that is, it's not just a partnership between Turkey and the United States. Well, they've come to this point in relationship where they need working groups, because there are a number of very important problems between the two countries. Syria and the U.S. cooperation with the YPG is one of them, and Turkey's military operations in Syria is, of course, adding fuel to the fire and only exacerbating that problem there. But Syria is not the only problem. Turkey is increasingly seen as it's drifting away from NATO. It's getting closer to Russia, into Russian sphere, and this has to do with the S-400s purchase as well. But in general, with Turkey joining the Sağda talks with Russia and Iran, we can see this as a pragmatic move by Ankara, but we can also see from Washington, it very much looks consistent with the rise of domestic authoritarianism in Turkey and the crackdown on civil society. They all fit this larger pattern that depicts Turkey as moving away from the values of NATO and the values that the transatlantic alliance and the West more broadly represent, and the kinds of anti-American rhetoric coming from the Turkish government, or of course in the most pro-government newspapers. Washingtonians, I think, understand that these are essentially sanctioned by the Turkish government, and such anti-Americanism is being fueled. They perceive this, and when they look at Turkey's relationship with Russia, it very easily juxtapose the two behaviors. So they interpret this as Turkey's broader drift away from it. And there are many analysts in D.C. who would say that this is not even a question of whether the United States is going to lose Turkey, but it's they would say that the fact remains that Turkey is already, the United States has already lost Turkey. So there's a very strong feeling accompanying Turkey's actions, not just specifically in Syria and the Afrin Man region in these places, but if we look at it as a more broader trend. The U.S. Congress is very strongly critical of Turkey, especially in this fall and this winter. There have been a number of calls about imposing targeted sanctions for various reasons, just for one reason. So I think this really shows how the mood in Washington is regarding bilateral relations right now. And it also explains why we hear so much call, both from within Congress and in the broader American society, for increased U.S. cooperation with Syrian Kurds, because Turkey looks like it is no longer a U.S. ally, which is, of course, a huge problem for bilateral relations, but also for NATO, and as consequences for NATO and the EU and the broader transatlantic alliance.
And finally, let's come to the issue of the Russian-made S-400 missile defense system. So the U.S. State Department had earlier threatened to apply, quote, appropriate measures against countries that want to buy Russian-made S-400 missile systems. And Turkey happens to be one of these countries and also happens to be a U.S. ally. Çavuşoğlu's response to this, quote, threat was the following, I quote, "We do not use and will not accept the language of threats." So my question to you is, how seriously do you think Turkey's possible S-400 purchase is being taken in Washington?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, in terms of not using or rejecting the language of threats, I mean, the Turkish officials, top-level Turkish officials, have, of course, been threatening the United States for striking at American soldiers embedded with the YPG in Syria. So if we're talking about the language of threats, certainly the Americans have taken threats coming from the Turkish government over the last few years. But beyond that, I think with the question of the purchasing of the S-400, as I said before, I mean, when Turkey does it, it's interpreted a little bit differently in Washington because it fits the broad trend of that increasingly depicts Turkey as getting closer with the Russian sphere, or the Eurasianist, as we would call it, but away from the transatlantic alliance. The whole discussion about the S-400s is taken very seriously because, I mean, A, President Erdogan seems very intent on purchasing them, and B, it's not the first time that Turkey has indicated it would make such deals with Russia or other countries that are problematic in the eyes of the United States. One thing with the S-400 that's S-400 purchase here is that there are two Russian companies involved in this sale from Russia to Turkey, and both of those are sanctioned by the United States already. And that's why we had some senators asking of whether Turkey or other allies who are looking to purchase S-400 from Russia be subjected to these sanctions if the sale actually goes through. And that is a very real possibility. It's also reminiscent of some of Turkey's actions before that. In 2013, Turkey was indicating that it wanted to purchase these missiles from China. Again, in that case, we had seen that the company that was involved in the sale was again sanctioned by the United States for having supplied missiles to Iran before. And there's the same problem with the Russian S-400s. The point is, I think, that while Turkey says that it wants to be less dependent on NATO technology for its own security, when it makes these deals with these actors and these companies that have been sanctioned by the U.S. because they have served interests that are directly antithetical to U.S. national security interests, then Turkey looks like a nefarious actor, not just an actor that's trying to establish itself as more independent than NATO. And we've also seen that back in 2014, Turkey again played a bit of a spoiler role in helping the interests of Russia when at a time in 2014 when the EU and Russia were at each other. The Ukraine, Turkey partnered up with Russia in the project of Turkish Stream, which would have brought Russian gas through Turkey into Europe. But this was at a time when the EU was seriously at loggerheads with Russia and was trying to reduce its own dependency on Russian gas. So now these are multiple instances where Turkey is partnering with actors like China and Russia, especially it's much more so with Putin, partly because of the personal relationship that with President Erdogan as well. But these actions signal to Washington a drift away in Ankara from NATO and from the relationship Turkey has with Washington and moving closer to the Kremlin. And again, it's the broader pattern of Turkey's increasing domestic crackdown, other government-fueled, government-sponsored anti-Americanism that is especially prevalent since the coup attempt in 2016. So given that these are all trends that come together, this is why the United States is now saying that Turkey might be sanctioned because of the S-400 purchase, because it's not the same as another NATO ally which doesn't share the same problems as Turkey, making the same move. I also want to add here, though, that the S-400s are not the only reason why Congress has been mentioning sanctions on Turkey. There's also, just last week, we had Senator write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal raising the issue of some human rights abuses in Turkey, especially as they relate to Turkish-American citizens or American citizens living in Turkey who have been jailed since the coup attempt as part of the purges. The Americans are very much concerned about their citizens being jailed in Turkey without indictments, without due process. And this is why Senator Longford mentioned the Magnitsky designations, which would be targeted sanctions if they did pass, if the United States did decide to pursue them, then it would be targeted sanctions. It would be specifically targeting Turkish officials or individuals that seem to be engaged in corruption or human rights abuses, and they would, of course, try to go through ones that relate to the United States, which have to do with, again, the Turkish-American citizen, the NASA scientist, Sağda, for example, who was just convicted to 7.5 years in jail, but also there's North Carolina Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was in jail since right after the coup attempt in 2016, and his case doesn't seem to be going anywhere. The most important problem, of course, is that not that they are jailed, but that there doesn't seem to be any due process looking at their suspicious actions or looking at the evidence. The fact that some of these individuals haven't even been able to talk to their lawyers and have a full attorney-client privileges with that are raising alarm bells in Washington. And so the Magnitsky designation and sanctioning Turkish individuals because of human rights abuses and corruption is one thing. Sanctioning potentially Turkey because of its purchase of S-400 in Russia is another thing. There's also, of course, the Zarrab trial, and the Halkbank might get fined because of that trial. There's also that discussion going on. So if we look at all of this together, I would actually say that the mood in Washington is very grim, has been this way for many months now, if not years. But we're seeing these voices get increasingly louder and increasingly bipartisan. It's coming from Republicans and Democrats, these kinds of demands. I think it's very telling about where Turkish-American relations are at this point. And I would say that the Turkish of the S-400s need to be read, and then the American reactions to his actions more broadly need to be read within this context.
Ms. Tahiroğlu, thank you very much for your comments and for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Turkish-German journalist Deniz Yücel was released from jail earlier this afternoon.
German Foreign Ministry confirmed earlier today that Turkish-German journalist Deniz Yücel, who had been detained in an Istanbul prison for a year, is set to be freed. A spokesman said the German government was relieved and glad, and thanked the Turkish judiciary. The spokesman pointed out that Germany's Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel had been working intensively towards a solution in his case. He also said there had not been any dirty deals. Yücel, who has both German and Turkish citizenship, is a correspondent for German daily Die Welt. He had been accused of working for a terrorist organization. At a meeting with Chancellor Angela Merkel yesterday, Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yıldırım had hinted that there was some movement in Yücel's case and that he hoped Yücel would be released soon. Last February, Yücel went to a police station for questioning on a report he wrote about the Turkish energy minister. He was arrested there and later accused of sedition and using terrorist propaganda to incite the population.
People's Democratic Party, HDP, held its third ordinary Congress on Sunday.
People's Democratic Party, HDP, held its third ordinary Congress in Ankara last Sunday. HDP lawmaker Pervin Buldan and Deputy Co-Chairman Sezai Temelli were unanimously elected as the new leaders of the party. The two replaced Selahattin Demirtas, who served as a leader of HDP since June 2014 and who is currently in jail over charges of supporting terrorism. Some 32,000 people, including members and supporters, attended the Congress, while reports suggested that around 500 people had been arrested in the days leading up to the event. The detentions were part of the crackdown on those who opposed the ongoing Operation Olive Branch against the YPG militia in Afrin. In a speech to the Congress, Pervin Buldan said that the HDP would continue to oppose government policies in dealing with Kurds both inside Turkey and also in the neighboring Syria. Just one day after her election to the post, the chief prosecutor in Ankara launched a criminal investigation into Buldan's speech and that of another HDP lawmaker Sırrı Süreyya Önder. The two are accused of terror propaganda over their description of Operation Olive Branch as an attack on civilian Kurds. Meanwhile, Serpil Kemalbay, a former HDP co-chair, was detained in Ankara on Tuesday as part of an investigation into her remarks, which the prosecutor's office said amounted to spreading terrorist propaganda at the party's third ordinary Congress last Sunday.
Former Chief of General Staff İlker Başbuğ's remarks over Turkey's ongoing military operation in Afrin received harsh criticism this week from the ruling Justice and Development Party and the Nationalist Movement Party.
Former Turkish Chief of General Staff İlker Başbuğ was slammed earlier this week by the ruling Justice and Development Party AKP and the Nationalist Movement Party MHP over his recent remarks on Turkey's military operation in Afrin. Başbuğ had said that the ongoing military operation in Afrin should not be used for domestic political purposes. It's unfortunate to hear such a thing from a Chief of General Staff. Is it his job to argue that the operation is being used as a political tool? Shame on him. What's necessary will be done. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, who is at the same time the AKP's chairman, told reporters on Tuesday. Speaking in an interview last week, Başbuğ had warned of politicizing the ongoing Operation Olive Branch in the Afrin district of Syria. Our soldiers are fighting and being killed in Afrin. Now is not the time to discuss politics when our soldiers are fighting and being killed, he said. Speaking before Erdoğan on Tuesday morning, MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli also criticized Başbuğ, saying that those who argue that our party is making political calculations over the Afrin operation have no character. Bahçeli further called on Başbuğ to explain who exactly is using Turkey's anti-terror fight for political purposes. Başbuğ served as Turkey's Chief of General Staff from 2008 to 2010. He was arrested in 2012 on terror charges as part of a now infamous conspiracy against Turkish army officials and spent 26 months in prison. It was later revealed that Başbuğ's arrest was one of many plotted by former judicial officials loyal to the movement of Fethullah Gülen, who is now believed to have masterminded the July 2016 coup attempt.
Main opposition Republican People's Party CHP legislator Enis Berberoğlu was sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in prison on spying charges.
Main opposition, Republican People's Party CHP lawmaker Enis Berberoğlu was sentenced on Tuesday to 5 years and 10 months in prison on spying charges. The decision of the Istanbul local court to sentence the jailed lawmaker to 25 years in prison was reversed by the appeals court, which lifted accusations of espionage and aiding a terrorist organization. Berberoğlu was found guilty of leaking classified material that should remain secret for the security of the state and its domestic and international benefit, the first-degree appeals court decided. Berberoğlu was accused of allegedly leaking footage showing the National Intelligence Organization's trucks sending weapons to Syria to former Daily Cumhuriyet editor-in-chief Can Dündar, who has been tried along with Berberoğlu in the same lawsuit and for whom the prosecutor demanded up to 15 years in jail. Dündar is being tried in absentia as he is currently residing in Germany. Berberoğlu is the first CHP lawmaker to be jailed after lifting of the legislative immunities in 2016. CHP had voted in favor of the lifting. I started out with 25 years, and it has been reduced to 5 years. Do not be demoralized, Berberoğlu told the audience in the courtroom. CHP leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu slammed the sentence passed on Berberoğlu. We do not accept this sentence. My brother Enis, do not worry. You will definitely be acquitted. We know that, Kılıçdaroğlu said at the CHP's group meeting in parliament. Speaking after the trial, Berberoğlu's lawyer Murat Ergün stated that the trial proved Berberoğlu's innocence. The appeals court lifted accusations of espionage and aiding a terror organization. This is significant, said Ergün, adding that he would demand that Berberoğlu's release case be taken to the Court of Appeals.
An Istanbul court sentenced journalists Ahmet and Mehmet Altan, Nazlı Ilıcak, and 3 others to life in jail over their involvement in the alleged media wing of the Fethullahist terrorist organization, FETÖ.
Istanbul 26th High Criminal Court has handed down aggravated life sentences to 6 journalists accused of involvement in the 2016 coup attempt. Those sentenced include Ahmet Altan, the former editor-in-chief of Taraf newspaper, his brother, economics professor and journalist Mehmet Altan, and journalist Nazlı Ilıcak. The defendants were accused of violating the Turkish constitution in a case against the alleged media wing of the Fethullahist terrorist organization FETÖ. The prosecutor demanded 3 aggravated life sentences and up to 15 years in jail for Ilıcak and the Altan brothers for attempting to remove the parliament and the government of the Turkish Republic or to prevent them from carrying out their duties. The 3 journalists are also accused of attempting to remove the constitutional order and committing crimes on behalf of an armed terrorist group without being a member of it.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Blue Man Group, the phenomenal crew named after the enigmatic bald and blue character of their own creation, will be at Zorlu PSM in collaboration with BKM until the 4th of March. Blue Man Group appeared in The Tonight Show, Arrested Development, Ellen, Schlag den Raab, produced by German host and comedian Stefan Raab, Wow Wow, which airs in Japan, and Caldeiro do Huck, which airs in Brazil. The group also received a Grammy nomination, contributed to many films and TV shows with their music, and released critically acclaimed albums, the latest of which is 3. The 17th IF Istanbul International Independent Film Festival, in partnership with İşbank Maximum Card, has announced its 2018 lineup. With 111 films to be screened from 36 countries, the festival's theme is To Life. The festival runs in Istanbul between February 15th and 25th. Chosen by many critics as the film of the year, Lady Bird premieres in Turkey at the opening night of IF Istanbul. The Disaster Artist, on the other hand, will be the festival's closing night film. IF Istanbul's gala section features the Turkey premieres of award-winning titles from Sundance to Venice, Toronto to Cannes, and festivals around the world that have been widely acclaimed. Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread, Sean Baker's The Florida Project, John Cameron Mitchell's punk film How to Talk to Girls at Parties, Ai Weiwei's Human Flow, Zambian director Rugano Nayoni's I'm Not a Witch, and famous British director Paul McGuigan's Film Stars Don't Die will be screened for the first time at IF in Turkey. One of the innovations of the IF Istanbul Independent Film Festival this year is IF Fresh. IF Fresh brings together films from the past year produced in Turkey, or films about Turkey. It aims to be a showcase for innovative emerging directors bringing in new stories about Turkey. These range from Turkey's first punk film, Tunç Arada, to Cano, the most recent example of Diyarbakır's groundbreaking independent cinema scene.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.